Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternative History Podcast. Don and Chris joining you today. Chris, there's people out there. I don't know if they're good or not, but we like to do something to them.
Hi, good people.
There we go. Now it's official. We did that within like
Yep.
7 seconds. We're officially into. I think we set a new record. It's the Olympics. I'm thinking the 100 meter. How do we get into an episode speed race now?
By the way, no, I think there've been a couple that I literally opened the recording with it.
I think
you're
you're
not
right.
on. Yeah,
I'd have to go back and look. So Chris is joining me today. We're going to take a. Actually, we were talking off podcast here about this and sort of thinking, have we done this one before? No, we've done things similar to this before, but we've never done this one. And it's almost such an obvious topic in a way. When we get into it, I think we'll see that. But for me, I think for most students of history, there are a couple of famous newspaper headlines when you see them sort of held up. And this one's got to be top 10, right? In terms of newspaper headlines, top 5, something like that, don't you think?
Yeah, it's the Boston Globe from when Brady blew the Super Bowl to Atlanta.
That's probably in somebody's top 10.
No, that's got to be that. Is like that might be the greatest Super Bowl comeback ever.
That's true. And I'm reminded of how things are different now than they used to be. First of all, we probably have a whole set of our listeners who we need to even explain what a newspaper actually is. That's the scary part now. Mm-hmm. But this idea that, they had press deadlines to go to press. And so you had to, you either got it in there or what. I can remember, as a baseball fan, like for the West Coast games when the Astros were playing like the Dodgers, the Padres, the games didn't start till 9:30. And so the box score may not be in the next day's paper. You may have to wait a day to see the box score because it was too late to make the publication kind of thing for the morning paper. And in fact, that's why a lot of cities, Houston was one of these, had a paper that was the morning paper and had a paper that was the evening paper. Mm-hmm. Which version do you want to get kind of deal? Okay, we've talked all around it. We're talking about the headline here that says Dewey defeats Truman. Now, in the real world, in our real timeline, even though there was a headline classically shown there, I'm sure some version of it is the episode art that we're using here because I can't help but go there. But in reality, Dewey did not defeat Truman, Chris.
Right.
And so we're talking about the 1948 election. And so our historical what if today is going to be really simple. We've already set it up. It's what would have happened if that headline were actually true. So maybe it's setting up some of the actual how in the world did we get the wrong headline to begin with, Chris?
So there's a lot going on. I think let me start it. So, okay, Harry Truman generally considered an accidental president. He was removed. He was put on the ticket in 1944 by the conventions, by the way, back when conventions used to matter. Yeah. Recording this a week out from the DNC.
Yeah, week after.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. In 1944, people, if you're president for 4 terms, you go through vice presidents, but FDR went through some vice presidents. Yeah. I want to say he had 4, right? He had 4 different running mates.
I think that is, and for different reasons, things swapped out of the things that were there. Yeah, probably most famous for those of us here in Texas would be the Texan that was his vice president. That'd be John Nance Garner, who had the official thing of warm whatever fluid you want to say that he actually said in terms of his evaluation about what the vice presidency was worth.
Well, yep, and that didn't get him invited back for a second round.
Right.
So it was Barkley in 36, right? Was it? Or no?
Yeah.
Barkley was
I could do a pretty good job, Chris, if I wanted to go through and name presidents in order. If you ask me to name vice presidents in order, that's where I will readily admit I will struggle for long periods there.
Well, he wasn't invited back. In 1940, it was Henry Wallace, right, who's going to play into our story again. In 44, in the middle of World War II, the Democratic Party felt like Henry Wallace was a little too lefty for their liking. And they removed him and put in Harry Truman, who at this point was a senator. But whenever you hear about him as a senator, they always talk about him as part of the Kansas City machine.
Right.
He was a friend, he was friends with people, and the Kansas Party machine in Missouri made him their senator. He came to national prominence by chairing a committee on wasteful war spending. And next thing you know, they put him, not only do they put him a heartbeat away from the presidency, but it's a pretty faint heartbeat at this point.
Right. Yeah. It's not exactly like, to use the medical health term, FDR is not exactly thriving.
I mean, this is probably the I mean, we've had, we've had presidents catch pneumonia and die during their inaugural address. This was probably a worse physical shape to run for president.
Right.
Um, so for some reason, the delegates to the DNC in 1944 thought it would be a good idea to nominate an unknown senator to be a heartbeat from the presidency in the middle of a world war with a president that already had a medical history of issues.
Uh-huh.
He died in office. Harry Truman took over, and the war's over. Harry Truman presides over the kind of demobilization of the United States, kind of coming down from a war economy. Um, it's really interesting time period because, like, right before the war, we're in Great Depression. So you've got, if you really think about it, somebody that's let's say somebody that's 18 years old in 1948 has no living memory of a normal America.
Right. Certainly no living memory of a pre-depression, pre-war America, because those two events buttress right up to each other in the ways that they do.
And there's a lot of, this is also, an interesting period because we promise we're not going to get too far into a lot of the other stuff, but to get into what's going on in America after the war, we just had, I mean, whenever there's a war, there's a lot of shaking up. You had, let's go ahead and talk about desegregation.
Right.
Right after the war, you had a kind of a first push and a first attempt from a lot of returning veterans to, hey, we kind of just fought this whole master race thing in Europe. Maybe we don't do it here. And Harry Truman, one of the things he did as president was order an official desegregation of the United States military. Interestingly enough, it had previously been desegregated. The United States government had been desegregated under Roosevelt. A little bit of the civil service had been desegregated. And Eric Rush's favorite president, Woodrow Wilson, had resegregated the United States federal government. Truman came in and undid some of that. And I think the reason I talk about that is that's going to lead to a lot of other stuff that happened in the 48 election that I think is reminiscent of how Woodrow Wilson became president. So civil rights is happening. We're going to come back to that. The other thing that's happening in the world is the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And I talked a little bit about Wallace, people thinking Wallace was very close to the Soviet Union. He was very progressive. And the reason I'm talking, a big part of the Democratic Party in the Depression and coming out of it were like democratic socialists. There were, people in the United States, a lot of them in the Democratic Party that looked at this and said, hey, listen, man, like this whole complete hands-off laissez-faire capitalism kind of almost destroyed the country. And so maybe we should not go back to that model, kind of the 19 roaring 20s model of free spending, all those things. So those two things, and it's weird because at this point, the Democratic Party contains all of this.
Yeah.
It contains all of these people.
To me, that was one of the interesting things when I was thinking it through. I remember this, remember talking about this election in political science classes in college just for the, how polling got it wrong. This is before we understood how to conduct, sample well for polling. And so that was part of the reason that there was the assumption that was there. But even, looking back at preparing for the episode a little bit and looking at some of the history, Wallace, you had someone run as a progressive in the case of Henry Wallace. Have to watch myself here because I think about the other Wallace.
Yep.
There's a Henry Wallace now. There's going to be a George Wallace later, which is ironic because then I'm going to mention Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, who at this point is a governor. He's not even a senator yet, which is hard to believe because I thought Strom Thurmond was a senator from right after the Constitution was ratified, all the way through until he died, or at least that's the way it feels.
I'm pretty sure he took over after Reconstruction.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have won Reconstruction. Other than that.
Yeah, because it seemed like Strom Thurmond was around forever, and he was to a great degree.
Yeah.
But so you have the Democratic Party that is very divided. To your point, what is Truman sort of presiding over here? And to your point, they're a big tent, and there's all kinds of subsections and flaps and other things that divide the tent up there. But they're a big enough tent that even divided up, they're a bigger tent than the Republican tent when it came down to capturing the Electoral College. So it's one of those things, from this point on, if you have a split in your party, it works against you or you almost have no chance to be elected. But the Democrats were such a majority relative to Republicans that we're not quite into that mode just yet. We're about to be there, though.
Well, I would say the signs were already starting because the Democrats lost the House in 46.
Right.
In the House of Representatives, you did have a majority of Republicans. So getting into the parties, the Democrats nominated Truman. The Dixiecrats, I believe their official name was States' Rights, right? They ran as the States' Rights Party.
I'm going to go with a yes there, but I will reserve the right if either of us are wrong.
Immediately forms their own convention and says, hey, Harry Truman's not actually our nominee. We're going to nominate Strom Thurmond, who is going to run on a ticket of resegregating the armed forces. We're going to stop all of this progressive stuff. It's going to sound very much like the kind of things you would expect either A, Strom Thurmond, or B, like for a modern person, a Republican to be talking about. At the same time, Henry Wallace and his acolytes and friends decide they're going to challenge and form a progressive party.
Right.
I don't know if they formed or they just took over the old almost progressives.
And I just confirmed that the official name were the States' Rights Democrats. So they had to get it all in there.
Well, because the interesting thing
for Thurmond.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, and I learned this doing the research, on the ballot in several states, Strom Thurmond appeared as the Democratic nominee. They kept a Democrat in there, and the states, I guess, recognized the Dixiecrat faction as the Democratic Party.
Perhaps those were Southern states, given the Dixiecrat.
Right. There's no perhaps. They absolutely were.
Yeah.
So you also had the Progressive Party split off and run, and if when you were taking political science classes, I think it was kind of assumed and taught that after 3 terms, a party is going to face electoral
Yeah,
gravity.
you've heard me talk about this so many times on episodes. This idea of the pendulum and the
Mm-hmm,
swing, and part of it, I just think, is people are like, okay, change. Something stays the same
mm-hmm,
for too long. Part of it's just voting for change,
mm-hmm,
but it's also the fact that the out of power party realizes at some point, and after 8 to 12 years, you really realize it at some
mm-hmm,
point that you have to retool and come at it a new way. And so that's why you have this tendency for reinvention. And again, not to carry
mm-hmm,
this too far down the party thing, but it does matter for this election for the reason that it does, and how it sets up after that is that the typical thing I was taught, which I think is a true way of understanding American political parties, is you're not going to maintain a third party for very long. And the reason for
mm-hmm,
that is it doesn't reach a critical mass and it fades away. Or if it is gaining enough mass because we have electoral majority system, one of the two parties is going to steal their issue to become theirs, or as we've had a couple of times, it will supplant the other party so that
mm-hmm.
you end up with only two. You'll have a third party briefly, but you cannot maintain the dynamics of a majority electoral system means that you don't maintain three
Mm-hmm.
parties for long because it's not a stable way to get
Right,
elected.
right. Um, so the Republicans are sitting there and they've just taken back the House for the first time in 14 years.
Mhm.
Again, like there are people voting in 1946 that don't remember a Republican House majority, don't remember anybody other than the Democrats running the country.
Well, for that part, except for the fact that Truman has just taken over, probably really don't even remember anybody other than Roosevelt as president.
Right, right. Um, then all of a sudden during convention season, the other party splits 3 ways. Uh, that is exactly what happened in 1912. That is exactly why there was actually a Democrat elected in 1912 and not another Republican. And so the Republicans looked at this situation and said, you know what? We're going to take our foot off the gas. We're going to start taking a victory lap, basically. They nominated their nominee from the time before, who was Thomas Dewey, governor of New York. Um, and during the research for this episode, I found Dewey really, really frustrating because he ran on nothing.
Yeah, he ran on being. This has been always been my impression. Whether it's true or not, he ran on the fact that he didn't run. He ran as a Republican, obviously, and he was a Republican. But what that meant for him was, I'm just not a Democrat.
Yeah.
And the general, sort of historical, particularly modern historical bend, pro business, a little bit more laissez-faire, that type of thing. There was the element of that, but it really, to your point, it was a campaign running on. It was the Seinfeld campaign. It was the campaign about nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it did not work very well for him. But it's also really frustrating for me because we're sitting here and I'm like, okay, like all of these things going on. This election is run during the Berlin airlift.
Right.
That is going on while the election is going on. You have, everything that leads to. In American labor policy, you have Taft-Hartley has just been passed. You have the beginnings of McCarthyism. You have all of these things going on, and you've got one side, which is, I just picture that old video of like Dave Brubeck on acid or something, just like going all crazy on the other side. And the Republicans are running a very boring guy, and there's no policy. There's no actual policy debates between these two sides on these things.
Right. And then the other thing that, Truman, that's what that campaign is well known for. Truman and his whistle
Mm-hmm.
stop campaign, and Truman, the This is where the "Give 'em hell" Harry really gets
Mhm.
its thing there. And of course, he's campaigning not so much he's campaigning for the presidency, but he's campaigning against the do nothing Congress.
Mhm.
And so, to me, one of the other things interesting about this campaign is that, well, Truman's just an interesting persona to me in
Mhm.
American history. You mentioned some of his background there, comes out of the Kansas City, machine. Part of the reason he's recruited is he's a World War I vet that was beloved by the soldiers that served with him and for him. And they know him there as the local haberdashery guy, in terms of that's what he
Mhm.
did after the war. He's very, very reserved, seems very reserved, except when he's not. And this comes across he comes across as a fiery challenger in the 48 campaign, which is a very stark contrast to, like you said, all we got to do is not lose this thing, is the impression that I have for Dewey. We just got to show up and we're there because
It's
they're in disarray.
it's a really interesting example to think about. I mean, what's going on right now as we're recording this, of an incumbent, even an incumbent office holder running as an insurgent, running with that kind of energy. And that definitely happened in 48. The other side did not have it. And I'm not saying that's what is happening. That is definitely what one of the campaigns right now, well, actually, both of the campaigns who have been president or have been in office are trying to run as the insurgent king.
Right. They're and again, I think it's fair to talk about the current campaign and the contrast there. The reason that the now Harris campaign, taking over from the Biden campaign, can run as sort of she's an insider
Mhm.
when she needs to be, by the way. This is the interesting way that it also parallels, I think, the 48 campaign, but she's able to say, I'm not, it's change and it's not change. You get to play both sides of the
Mhm.
equation. And Truman's sort of in the same boat. Again, I mean, the thing that jumped out at me that I hadn't really thought through as well, he's elected in the fall of 44. He's
Mhm.
barely been the vice president before Roosevelt dies. I mean, we're talking not just a matter of, a year. We're talking about a very small fraction of a year.
Whenever you hear about it, you always hear that Truman did not learn about the bomb until he was president.
Right. And the reason for that is not, yes, he was being kept in the dark about something that had, was a very high classified, state secret,
Which,
but it's
by the
also, there
way,
just hasn't been enough time to bring him up to speed on
yeah,
everything.
by the way, and not casting aspersions on anything that happened whatsoever, but like if you made your name as a senator on a committee investigating the federal war budget and didn't know about the Manhattan Project, that says some things about some things.
Yeah, I've even heard some folks speculate, this whole idea that Truman did know. In fact, that's the reason they put him on the ticket, was he was so that it's a way of
Mhm.
neutralizing that he's going to find out. So we're going to make him vice president, so he understands why he shouldn't expose
Yeah,
this kind of thing.
regardless. It's been a lot of time talking about
The
what
what
did
did?
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a good point, but it sets up a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in the what didn't, or in the what if here.
Mhm.
So again, it was assumed for a lot of reasons. We've already talked about what they are: the division inside the Democratic Party, the personalities that were there, the fact that there had been a Democrat in office for a very long period of time, a time of change is coming on here.
And think about 1920, like Republicans are who you elect after a time of international upheaval to get back to normal.
Right. So, and we talked about Dewey sort of being, to me, he's almost like a two-dimensional figure in
Mhm.
history. And that maybe that's because I've never read a Dewey biography. Somebody probably wrote one, but I don't even know what the best Dewey biography will be,
Mhm.
which tells you a lot, right? Because he, again, for being governor of a large state, being governor of New York, but once you get removed from it historically, like we are, you're not in it. He's sort of a non person. So what do you think? Let's try to isolate it down now to the what if. What would be the biggest difference between a Dewey presidency and the Truman presidency that we got? If you had to go with we're going to talk about multiple things,
Mhm.
but the one that would be at the top of your list, what is that, Chris?
The importance of Robert Taft.
Okay.
Um,
Elaborate.
so Robert Taft is, I believe it, I want to say at this point he's a senator. If not a senator, he's a congressman from Ohio. He's, you know what? It just hit me. He's from that Taft family. If we're going for another 1912 um, overlap here. And I don't think that Dewey was necessarily from this wing of the Republican Party, but it was absolutely an important wing of the Republican Party, which is the past 20 years have been a nightmare, and we need to just go back in our we need to go back behind the oceans, and we need to trade with we need to basically do what we did in the 1920s. We need to trade with the world. We need to engage in commerce with the world, but we do not, under any circumstances, need to keep spending our money on bombers. We do not need to have our troops in Germany. We do not need to constantly have this sense of we don't need to be the world's policeman. They can solve their own problems, and we need to let them do that. And I don't think that again, I don't think Dewey was that, but I think there was a lot of that in the Midwestern. The only people that stayed Republicans through the 1940s.
Right. And so how is Dewey different than Truman? Inauguration day plus 100 days in 49. What would distinguish the Dewey presidency from what we saw from the Truman presidency?
I think he starts undoing a lot of what Truman did to get us ready for the Cold War. It's interesting that the Republicans are generally the more hawkish about the threat of communism, but I think they are going to kind of look at this and say, we've got the bomb, and we don't need and there was some of this in the Truman administration, but they're going to look at this and say, we've got the bomb, nobody else does. US out of everywhere. We honestly, like, Chiang Kai-shek, man, you can't cut it on your own. That's fine. We're going to cut and run. We don't necessarily need to keep supporting you. If the Chinese people don't want you, they don't want you.
Yeah. And in 47, Truman, as president, has enunciated the Truman Doctrine.
Right.
Which is, if you're under pressure by the Soviets or by your nation is at risk of going in that direction, we're going to intervene and be supportive of the forces that are not communist forces in your nation.
Right. It's similar to, we talked on a previous episode, kind of like the Nixon Doctrine. We will give you everything you need to do this fighting.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember I think one college history professor talked about it. This is Lend-Lease to a degree part 2.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just, it's different in terms of who you're lending and leasing to, but it's Lend-Lease part 2. We will be the arsenal for democracy, which means in this case we're the arsenal for anti-communism, as the case might be.
And that's what Truman is doing. I think another really important part of that is the Marshall Plan,
right,
which is going on in Europe. And I think Taft just looks at this and says, you know what? Thinking about the Berlin airlift that's going on as this is going on. Hey, listen, like, why do I need to take your money to feed ex-Nazis? Why do we need to do that?
So it's sliding America back into isolationism to a degree under a Dewey presidency, right? Engaged a different way, but still moving away from being actively engaged in the way that Truman was.
It's not as actively security engaged. I think that's the best way to put it.
Okay. And making changes on the domestic front, as part of this as well. Certainly being more, business friendly versus, because,
Uh-huh.
the continuation is, Roosevelt gives the New Deal, and what does Truman come along with? He comes along with the
Fair
Fair
deal.
Deal,
A fair
right?
deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's continuing in the same vein, but slightly different.
Mhm.
But that coalition that existed, the New Deal coalition that Truman has, you know, altered a little bit in terms of his trajectory. So, I think there is a foreign policy difference between being Dewey being less likely to do that. That leads me into my next big difference. The other big thing that happens on Truman's first term, that's his term being elected outright in 48. Now this is Dewey in office, is a little conflict in
Mhm.
Southeast Asia comes along.
I'd say Northeast, but yeah.
Okay. And we were talking off podcast here, the
Yeah,
parallels exist.
they confused even you about which one of them it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one has the 17th parallel in play and the other one has the 38th in play. So that tells you a little bit about what's going on, right?
Yeah.
Um, is Korea. So Truman is very willing to engage, again, partly because of the Truman Doctrine that he's
Mhm.
enunciated. He's very willing to engage with the cover of the United Nations supporting this. So it's not just a unilateral U.S. action. In fact, this is sort of the first time, yeah, we saw other things with the UN, but this is the first time we see it in a big way
Mhm.
after its formation at the end of World War II. But the U.S. engages and sending forces and being part of the coalition, leading the coalition that's going into Korea. So my question for you is, President Dewey doing the same thing or doing something different there, Chris?
Um, I don't think Dewey can do what Truman does. I think it's important. I mean, for Americans to think and understand, like how near run the beginning of Korea was. And I talked a little bit about drawing down American non nuclear power. Even Truman had a lot of people telling him and thinking that the next war is just we're going to need a small number of people with rifles to defend our air bases. And then we can just blow the other people's cities off the map. That's all we need to do. That is a very cheap solution when you think about what defense cost.
Right.
Um, and I think the small government, the cost cutting measures of a Dewey administration might just get us to the point that we don't have, the flexibility. We in our Falklands episodes, we talked about what would have happened if the United Kingdom had decommissioned their aircraft carrier, which was scheduled to happen a couple of months later. Um, during this period, there was a discussion of disbanding the United States Navy because we don't need a navy anymore. We need an army to defend the bases, and then we'll have bombers, and that's
We
all
have
we
a,
need.
we have an air force to deliver the bombs.
Mhm.
Eventually, we'll have missiles, so you still don't even need, eventually. But at this point, that's
Mhm.
obviously still premature. Um, I tend to agree that there would have been a less. I don't even know what word to actually use to describe it. I'm just going to call it a lack of desire to be as militarily engaged in the response under a Dewey versus a Truman, or to your point, a
Mhm.
different type of response. So I guess that leads me to the logical question, because Truman obviously was not willing to make the decision to do what it probably was suggested to him by a number, just go in and drop the bomb and
Mhm.
you can get this thing over with. Um, any risk that Dewey actually succumbs to that and we go nuclear in Korea, in your opinion?
I think there is some of it because we just don't have any other options. I think the other possibility is, and I think it's kind of I want to say it was Dean Acheson. I could be wrong about this. In a speech in 1950, couple of months before the North Korean invasion, basically said like Korea is not, laid out what is our core interest area in Asia and left Korea out of it. There is an argument to be made that Korea is an East Asian Munich. I think that could that's the other real possibility for me, which is this is the kind of all right, wait a minute. They're not playing around and we don't have anything we consider realistic. We don't have any options because we need the ability to respond to whatever's going on, and we don't have that. And I think that could be what happens here.
So are we left with a dilemma of not willing to engage in quite the way that Truman did with committing resources, or those resources just aren't there because they've been cut in the
I
before
I,
it comes along in 50?
I think I think the resources just aren't there.
Okay. So the resources aren't there, and then there's a lack of willingness, let's say. Dewey's like, well, this is not bomb worthy, is the way that
Yes,
I think of that in my head. And so does Korea just fall under that
yes,
scenario?
yes,
So if
yeah.
that happens, we talk about domino effects all the time. That becomes the thing that comes after this is the domino effect. That's part of what, plays into Vietnam, plays into other situations as well. Um, is that the first domino to fall, and do we expect others?
I I don't know that we expect others. Um, there's going to be other dominoes pushed over. I feel like if one of the things I talked about was the role of Marshall Plan and Truman in getting Europe on their feet to the point where we formed NATO in 1949. And that to me is a real question. And, if you look at the Cold War, one of the things was we locked in Europe. We locked in there, and basically both sides, tacitly agreed that we're not changing that, and we'll go at each other everywhere else.
Right.
I think a lack of commitment during this critical 4 year period could lead to issues with the Soviets not recognizing the European border.
Hmm. So you end up with a sooner version of some kind of at least warm war, if not a hot war back in Europe.
I think I could easily envision little green men in West Germany. Um, I think the Truman Doctrine was a response to the Soviet Union trying to use democratic means and asymmetrical means to topple Western European countries. In that case, it was Greece, but there was a large communist party in France. The first post, actually, for fans of The Godfather, um, in part one, in the background of Michael and Sicily, there's election posters to the first post fascist election in Italy, where the communists are going to play a major role. And I think that could be a real possibility that you see not a traditional invasion, but I think the Marshall Plan is almost more important than NATO because it stabilized those countries.
Right. And in a very different way. We've talked about this before, how World War One sows all the seeds that lead to World War Two, so
Mm-hmm.
much so that I've come to think of them as one long extended conflict where you change the roster and batting order a little bit all the way through. But that was part of the reason for the willingness to the Marshall Plan. The rebuilding needed to be there because unlike World War One, it was a much wider devastation there, but also this idea of we're not going to set this up so that somebody economically is going to have an easy path to turning these countries into something we don't want them to
and
be.
and just before people think, well, no, the Soviets were kind of blunt instrument, Red Army types. I mean, what's going? Don't forget the post-war settlement in Eastern Europe was you're going to have elections with a communist party present. It wasn't that the communists are going to take over. So they definitely use those political infiltration means in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and in Poland to extend their influence and create what what we, when you and I were, I guess I wasn't quite covering geopolitics in kindergarten, but
Oh,
when
you were Chris, you just didn't know what to call it.
but when you were learning, your Eastern European history, it was taught that the Soviet Union, the like T-34s came in after the war, and that's why they're Russians today.
Yeah, the a very simplistic view of what was there, and I'll say one of the things that's happened as a result of this podcast, and also because of your knowledge of East European history, which puts mine to shame, is the realization there's a lot more going on there. And by the way, there's been a lot more going on there for a long time than we want to realize as we move through that. So, do we? I don't think we've come up with a high opinion of what Tom Dewey is going to be as president now, but is he likely to be more than a one-term president?
No, I actually think, and I'm reminded of really interesting thing looking at the Wikipedia research I was doing before this. If you are just sitting there scrolling through um, the Wikipedia page for the 48 election, there's a person who's on both sides of who's mentioned in both conventions as a possible nominee, and that's Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah, to me, one of the interesting things about Ike, and we've had a number of conversations about Ike, including his smoking preferences
Mhm.
and how that things have gone out of that. But you know, literally, he was is he a Republican? Is he a Democrat? Well,
Mhm.
he's an American hero. He's a war general. This both parties looked at to me the closest modern, relatively modern. It's now a little bit dated. I realize, it was. Gee, it sure would be nice to have Colin Powell.
Yep.
Kind of thing. The very
Mhm.
very similar profile there, and sort of centrist moderate in a lot of the views there. A common sense kind of thing. That Powell was the next generation or two generations down the road Eisenhower of, both parties thought this could be our guy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And as it turned out, that the Republicans in 52 in the real timeline, are you suggestive here that in 52 it's we Democrats like Ike, let's get him elected in
I do.
response to Dewey?
I think that so, and yeah, I really think he gets elected as a Democrat, and I think Thomas Dewey goes down in history as Dr. Eric Rush's other least favorite president because he just comes in because the other party just implodes and screws a whole bunch of stuff up himself.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before because we've done this a lot. We've been doing a lot of episodes that are sort of in the same vein of where you change the president, and then you start running the ripples down of, okay, who's next? Do the same people show up? Do people get accelerated, pushed back? Do people just miss their window of opportunity because that was their window of opportunity, and then somebody else comes along? So we won't speculate much beyond that, but it is different potentially if you have 1953 come on the scene, and yes, it's still President Eisenhower, and it's a little d and not a little r in terms of what that means for subsequent elections, and even flowing all the way down into 1960. And the one thing I'd be pretty safe about, I think, only unless he won a really big poker hand and was able to parlay that into something, is 52 elected Eisenhower doesn't have Richard Nixon as his vice president.
And I agree with that. And I think, by the way, there's something really interesting to just think about, which is we haven't talked about McCarthyism, but if it's a President Dewey that loses China, I think that, the Democrats were kind of painted as the communist-ish
Hmm.
people. If it is President Dewey that loses China, I think that could mean some really interesting, some really different things as well for all of that. And how much of that played into the early Eisenhower era?
Yeah, and also the Cold War is still going on. It may be a little bit different now in terms of how it's played out because of a difference in Korea and what happens
Mhm.
elsewhere as a result of that. And I think that's true, but I think it is that interesting concept of it's we tend to do this. We're doing it now. We tend to talk
Mhm.
about as if the presidency is all that matters in these epochs of 4 and 8 years at a time, right? When in reality, it's what's going on with the other party, the tendency of the midterm election for the party that does not occupy the White House to gain seats
Mhm.
in Congress. You'd already talked about what had happened. Part of the reason Truman's able to be successful in 48 is he's running against the do nothing Republican Congress
Mhm.
that's come into power. And so, yeah, I think it's simplistic, which is why it's so complicated. Which is also why I like alternate history to think about. Is the fact that these okay, yeah, it makes a difference who's sitting in the Oval Office, but because of who's sitting in the Oval Office, what other things change because of how things either align with or align in response to
And,
or against whatever's happening there.
and I think that's one of the reasons I like this. We talked off podcast. The average, okay. A lot of people think, well, okay, World War II is over and it leads right to Korea.
Right.
There's 5 years there. A lot is going on. And I think another interesting thing, just to, we talked about what a blank slate Dewey was. And it's really interesting to think about having such a wild card in such an important position with all of these currents going on. I mean, that's when you ask me what does a Dewey presidency look like, I immediately talked about somebody who's not even the guy himself.
Right.
Who's
Are, are you? Well,
right?
maybe Thomas Dewey is the Wyoming of presidents. Maybe he doesn't even actually exist.
Interesting.
Just saying.
Interesting.
We've invoked Dr. Rush a number of times here, so that's another way that we can do it. So, yeah, the only place we'll go is sort of that, that again, not wanting to go too far downstream, but it obviously does make a difference if Eisenhower is elected as a Democrat in 52. I think there's a strong possibility that in many ways his presidency is different but the same because it doesn't matter. Again, the point is it doesn't matter
Mhm.
sort of what he's declared himself as in terms of how it's there. But it certainly does mean that instead of having 8 years of a Republican administration, you have 8 years of a Democratic administration. So by the time you get to 1960, now you have a different set of dynamics that are in play. And to me, the real curious issue there is that could Eisenhower as a Democratic president, so the leader of ironically, the leader of the party that he's just recently declared, this is what I am kind of thing, which is sort of odd, is does that play out differently in terms of, the thing that led to the situation in 48? So the split that exists inside the Democratic Party on the questions of civil rights and on other types of things as well, in terms of does more get done in the 50s with a Democratic Eisenhower on some of those issues where the party gets united or comes to an understanding, or does it just continue to bubble along and we have what we have in the 60s just in a different form because it's just going to take that much time?
Um, I think that it's going to happen. I'm part of me says that a Democrat may have trouble doing it. Um, it took a Texas Democrat
Right.
to pass a lot of those things, and somebody who, Nixon could go to China, Johnson could fight the Klan. and it took somebody who's got those bona fides to do it. And I think I envision that Eisenhower could. He because he doesn't come out of the American party system, because he is such a unifying figure. Um, it's possible. He did nominate Earl Warren to the court, who
Right.
was Dewey's running mate, actually. I could see that. But it's just I don't know that he makes it the priority.
Yeah. To me, the real wild card for me in that is trying to think through. Well, even thinking through where Korea sits as a conflict into the 52 election with a Democratic Eisenhower challenge to a Republican Dewey, even in how that election goes down.
No. I don't think Korea is an issue at the 1950 midterms.
It's over.
It's over.
It's over almost before it starts.
It's over before it starts. Now there's a post-mortem associated with it in terms of who lost China, who lost Korea, why weren't we able to do anything about this? But it's over.
So again, this has become now more about another version of an Eisenhower presidency as much as about a Dewey presidency. But I think that's where it's relevant and where it's is that my assumption would be after that. Now you've elected somebody with who understands the importance of having a military that is large enough to do what you need it to do, understands logistic, that's I think Eisenhower's great gift as a general was his understanding of logistics and what it is to have material and men where you need them to be and move them around. So I think you have a buildup of the US military under Eisenhower in the 50s.
And allies.
Yeah.
And allies. He understands the importance of the European alliances. So a NATO happens maybe with a few less members.
But you might argue, a stronger or more directed, more willing to engage NATO, an allies part two to a degree.
Maybe. Yeah. I could see some kind of a, officially demilitarized, a Germany that looks a little like Austria. That is actually like both sides agree to withdraw troops because both sides are afraid of each other. Right. I could see that.
Right. That makes sense to me. Anything big we missed, Chris, without turning it into a 4-hour episode?
Yeah. Everything domestic. I mean, we really didn't pull the McCarthyism thread. We didn't talk about what would he do in terms of, hey, all of these troops coming home, they want jobs. What happens to the economy? What happens to, I'm going to go ahead and tease something which I know we've talked about in the Discord, and I know people are interested in. Harry Truman at this point makes one of the first American pushes for a national health system.
Right.
And some of our fans across the pond have talked about the importance of what happened in, how Britain handled World War II as to what started the NHS, and how America handled World War II in terms of what started our healthcare system. And both of them really start around there. And I think this is another opportunity, where if you have a different person or a person listening to different people, I think that's the best way to describe a Dewey campaign, because other than hating the mafia, I do not know what he stood for.
Yeah, and part of what I wonder there, and now I'm giving myself an assignment. I feel like I need to go learn 10 things about Thomas Dewey that I didn't know, because I didn't spend hours and hours researching ahead of the episode here. But I think when I go and do that, I'm not going to find that much. That's the reality of it. And I think that played itself out, and I think you described it very well. And again, we did talk a lot more about the what did as much as we did about the what if initially. Is that um, it's a little bit of that Napoleon concept we've heard so much about lately for other reasons. When the enemy's doing what he does to defeat himself, stay out of the way. And I think that
Mhm.
was a lot of what the Republican and Dewey's thought was, we just got to make sure we
Mhm.
stay out of their way. They're divided. They're going to do what they're going to do as Democrats, Dixiecrats, and progressives, and all these other things. We just got to get out of the way. And probably the other thing, I'll just say this, Truman is one of my favorite, again, personas in American history, is that Harry Truman gets underestimated in a lot of ways and a lot of
Mhm.
times. It's one of those instances where well, yeah, he's that senator from Missouri that nobody knew about, the accidental president that's just there because of whatever. But after the 48 election, nobody's taking Harry Truman lightly, because he's just proven that you take Harry Truman lightly, you do that at your own risk.
Mhm.
See what's going on there. All right, good stuff, Chris. We just want to thank our listeners again for listening. And Chris sort of dropped it there, so I'll pick up on it as well. We really enjoy having a Discord server. And if you haven't, you may not be familiar with Discord or what that's about. It's a place to go. And if you like social media, yeah, whatever. I stay away from it now as much as I can most of the time these days for all kinds of reasons. I will go and check the Discord server first to see who's popped in there, because I find the people there, even when I disagree with them, more intelligent, more capable of articulating positions. And it's a place that we go and we get feedback from our listeners. We get suggestions from our listeners. When I'm looking at our topical queue now, I know we were looking at it, Chris, and determining what to record today. Half of our topical queue has come out of our Discord suggestions
Mhm.
here in the last 6 months or so. So we get good stuff there and we get good feedback there. And yeah, podcasting is a one-way audio medium. But it's a place that we get our feedback from, and we get the circular things that are going on there. So if you haven't checked that out, check it out. I encourage you to do so. If you haven't checked the website out, I encourage you to do that. One of the things I think I mentioned before, but I'll do so again. Now we've now updated. It's not sophisticated, but now if you are new to the show and you haven't listened to back episodes, used to you had to try to figure out what the episode was about from
Mhm.
sometimes a cryptic, almost intentionally cryptic title that was attached to the episode. And now if you go to the index that's listed there, you'll see that, but you'll also see a description about what the episode's about. So you can go through and pick out the things that you might like. Even look in the right-hand column and see who's on the episode. If you don't like Don, you're going to have a problem finding too many episodes that don't have me. But if there's somebody else who's your favorite, like Chris, or somebody who's not your favorite, again, that could be me. It's easy to go through and pick those things out. Just that's one of the things that we've upgraded and added to the website. I'm just going to put the push in here. We don't do it as often. I'm going to do it a little bit more. If you like the show and you want to participate, you can go to the website as well, and you can get you some a fork in time or room where it happened gear, some logoed stuff. We have one of our listeners who's coming up to be part of the show here on an episode we're going to be recording in the next couple of weeks. And I know for a fact that Evan has a Fork in Time shirt, as does his fiance, because I've seen them. I've seen pictures of them in the shirt, so I know that that works. Then, of course, there's always the option to support the
Uh,
show
it,
via.
it, it works to get merchandise. We're not saying if you buy somebody a shirt, they will agree to marry you.
That's correct, but it could. I'm not saying it's not either.
We don't know.
We don't know.
You know what? To kind
We're
of
gonna.
get back,
We'll ask Evan when he's on the episode.
so to get back to like the crux of this, we don't have a large enough sample size.
There you go. Which was the problem, by the way, with the problem
Yeah,
with the 1948 polling that suggested Dewey had won. They didn't have a large enough sample, and they didn't have the
yeah,
right sample, because
yeah.
they called people on the phone, and you were more likely to have a phone if you were a Republican.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's the classic thing that we learned about it in polling in college, in political science classes, of how not to conduct a poll. See anything that was done with the 48 election as being a good place to start when it comes to sampling. Um, if you do choose to be a patron, that's a way you can support the show for as little as $2 a month. There are some benefits that patrons get. Talking about merchandise, they get a discount on merchandise. A lot of people don't realize that. I don't mention that as frequently as it could, but there's a discount for our patrons. There's a code that they can use all the time that's active there. And also it helps defray the cost of the show. It's not super expensive, but it does add up. But then there's also the benefit of getting early access to episodes. And we have become, I'm proud of us, we've become much, much more disciplined and better about having our episodes in the queue, such that there is an episode to release early. That wasn't always the case. And now we do. So if you'd like to hear things, a week, sometimes a little bit more than a week early, that's another advantage of being a patron. But all of that aside, but we don't expect that from you. What we thank you for is your time and attention and being a listener and being loyal and giving us, again, some of your most valuable commodity, which is your time. So on behalf of Chris, the team that's not here, and on behalf of myself, we're going to suggest to you, as we always do as we close off here on A Fork in Time, if you happen upon A Fork in Time, our suggestion is just go ahead and take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.